Okay, our next talk is another remote talk. Please welcome Gunjan. He's going to be talking about generative AI and how to generate wiki pages. So thanks for giving this talk and thanks for joining us. I'll turn you over now.
Sure. Thanks so much. And hi, everyone. I'm Gunjan. I'm someone who's been in the NLP space, doing a variety of work from research to industry work to a lot of other things over the last few years. And so I've learned quite a bit about the AI space. And it seems that generative AI is now at the forefront, and everyone wants to know how relevant it is to their own company, their own industry, and how they can best make use of it. And this presentation is a very quick walkthrough of some of the things that might be worth looking at. So moving on. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, what is generative AI? And most people's introductions to generative AI came in the form of ChatGPT in December of last year. But generative AI can be a lot wider than that. All it is really just some automated agent, we'll call AI, that's able to generate something. And usually this comes in the form of text, images, or speech. So I'm sure most people are aware of ways that text can be generated, which comes in the form of ChatGPT and many of OpenAI services. But there's also Bard, Google's competitor to ChatGPT. But less well known and less talked about are the generation of images and speech. So there has been some work in trying to generate full images from, say, a single text prompt. And one of the forefronts of that has been a model called DALL-E by OpenAI and another model called Stable Diffusion. So there are ways to now generate images that are realistic and that people can't really figure out. And of course, there are deepfakes, which have been around for a while, but have been getting more and more realistic over the last few years. So you might end up seeing, say, a video of Trump speaking in Chinese that's entirely fake, but will look otherwise realistic, except for the fact that I imagine that the former president does not know Chinese to do that. But overall, generative AI has been taking the world by storm, and it's been coming in a variety of forms. In terms of how these models work and how they're built, what they're doing is they basically are trained on practically the entire internet. For the text models like ChatGPT, OpenAI has scraped pretty much the entire internet and used that to basically teach its model about, I guess, how the world works. In the case of images, Google Images is an enormous database and has been used to train models. For speech, the data sets tend to be a lot smaller. Sometimes these big tech companies just end up getting their own recordings, but usually the ones that almost all of them use are just speech recordings from audiobooks, usually children's audiobooks, to help figure out what they should be doing. And so what is done with each of these forms of data is we'll take a part of it, and the model basically has to predict the rest of it. So let's just say we have maybe like the example, Luke, I am your father. We will remove the word father and have the model basically predict what that word might be. So Luke, I am your, and the model has to predict father. And if it gets it right, it's rewarded. And if it gets it wrong, it will learn from its mistake and naturally figure that out. So just by predicting the next word, GPT and text models like it are able to get really, really good performance. And that's a big driver of what we see today within generative AI. And similarly for images and speech, it may not be as simple as the next word, but it might be just like the top right corner of the image, or in the case of speech, maybe the next second that was hidden away. So that's the way that a lot of these models are trained. They're trained in order to basically predict what might come next, given a context like a text, speech, or image prompt that they're given earlier. So generative has honestly been around for a while. The original GPT came out in 2018. Deepfakes has been around for nearly a decade at this point. But why exactly do they work so well, and why are they coming out in the forefront now? Like, why am I even giving this talk now instead of maybe like 5 years ago? So it turns out that there have been two key parts that have been found that have made them work really well, and that's one of the key reasons why they happen to be here today. So size is key. So anyone who wants to try and learn a new language will find it relatively easy to understand what that language means just by going to a few classes, maybe taking a few years or doing Duolingo or something. That is relatively easy compared to literally being able to speak as a language as a fluent speaker. It takes a lot more work to generate something that understands something, which was what makes speaking a language quite difficult for most people. Same concept goes toward text generation, but also image and speech generation. So generation and creating something from scratch is inherently difficult for both models and humans. And so these models also need to be really large in order to be able to handle this task. Think about how big a model is essentially representing, or how big an AI is ultimately representing its brain size in essence. The more it has, the more things it can learn, the better it can do, the more difficult tasks it can do. And so that's been one reason for why the term large language models, or LLMs, have been used to describe the space, because without the huge size that these models are, it simply would not be possible for these AIs to be able to do anything at nearly the level that they are today. They would essentially just maybe generate half an image or like the next 10 words and then completely fall apart and just embarrass itself. So that's been one key driver of those results. The second thing is that many of these models are specifically trained to follow human instructions. So yeah, there's a lot of data on the internet that's online, like Google Images or just random Reddit threads that people can go at and for models can learn from, and just how humans talk. But not all of this data is created equal, and naturally there are some forms of images or text that humans prefer more than others. We go to a museum because we really want to see good artwork. We herald people like Picasso because we think he does great art. Naturally, we want our models to have some sort of signal to basically learn what humans consider good and what humans don't. And so, as a second stage in what these AIs learn, these models are taught to follow humans' instructions for what generations they like most. So, when someone, a teacher, an English teacher, is grading an essay, there are some things that they're going to like more, and there are some things they're going to like less. And so now these models are basically being put in toward an English class, and they are basically being taught how to get the best grade possible from what is effectively the English teacher. So models are going to learn that humans would much rather see something like, this text is incredibly well written, over some misspelling, failed capitalization attempt at this is great text or something. Now, usually by this point, the models are already good enough to generate. It will probably not create something as terrible as the latter, but the example is just showing that there are some types of text and some type of images that humans naturally like more than others. And so the model learns to align itself with, I guess, what pleases the human experience. And I do know that I've been giving a lot of examples on the fact that there is some forms of art that humans like more than others. It just so happens that generative AI actually hasn't used that trick for images yet. This alignment with human instructions has been exclusive with text, but I imagine that it will eventually be there in images. Wouldn't surprise me if OpenAI did that in like a year, but yeah, it's kind of an open opportunity out there. So one core part of what I want to focus on is ChatGPT. And the reason for this is, one, everyone knows what it is, but also because it's the first generative model available to the public, free of charge, with no technical background necessary. It's pretty much as simple as, say, using Google or a search engine like it. So previously, if you wanted to use generative AI, you'd have to use some sort of APIs. You'd have to go toward writing code, finding some model library like Hugging Face, and basically setting up a long training script to effectively use generation yourself. ChatGPT drops that barrier enormously, as pretty much anyone who has used it has figured out. So the next few minutes will probably sound a little bit like a tutorial of how to prompt engineer ChatGPT, but at some extent, there is some valuable knowledge to come here. So ChatGPT is best used when providing instructions to the model on what you want it to do. So these models will change its performance pretty dramatically depending on what instruction you give it. It tends to be pretty robust for fairly common instructions like asking questions or writing essays for particular topics. But as you get more granular, you're going to have to be more careful as to how you ask it questions and what you want it to do. And for many of you who are wanting to generate wikis or augment your wikis with content, it'll sometimes be on things that maybe ChatGPT has not previously been trained to learn. And so as a consequence, you might have to be careful on what you talk to it by. And ultimately, it's important to test out what prompts work well at ChatGPT to see exactly what works best for your specific use case. And while this type of concept doesn't just apply to ChatGPT, you can use it for pretty much any text generation model. It is something that is most easiest to hone in ChatGPT because OpenAI is subsidizing this for free, and it's definitely an opportunity to take. And I do want to note that Bing Chat is not really a substitute here, mainly because the marketing of Microsoft has been that they're putting in ChatGPT into Bing. And that's not happening. And if you try to use Bing Chat to do any serious form of generation, you will largely find yourself disappointed. The reason for it is basically Bing Chat is an entirely different model. It does take OpenAI's latest model, GPT-4, but then it's trained further on a different task. Basically, OpenAI decided that they wanted to teach their model how to use a search engine. So they had a bunch of people go on Bing, type in a few queries, click on a bunch of links, much like you would use a search engine, and then highlight in each of those links that mattered the content that they found most relevant to answering the search query. So the whole idea behind Bing Chat is effectively trying to automate web search. It tries to go through the links and through the web pages for you so that you can ultimately basically get the information that's most relevant for you. And this might be something that may be very relevant for your wikis in the future, because if someone's able to literally automatically go through your wiki and find the most relevant information to your question, then your wiki becomes a database for this AI to effectively answer questions for you. And my friend and your colleague, Jeffrey, will be talking to some extent about an early prototype that was made to try and do this. But as we get further and further, it is naturally going to be the case that wikis will be a source of information that many type of AI bots are going to be able to retrieve from and basically automatically use the search engine. And so Google itself is going to be something that people are going to be able to automate. So, but part of that is a digression from what I want to talk about with ChatGPT. So the things it'll work best on are ultimately the types of data that it has been trained on. So this data set is very broad by now. Things like Wikipedia, 19th and 20th century books, computer code, law, biomedical sciences, Reddit, patents, and basically high school and college standardized tests and competitions. That stuff is basically the type of things that ChatGPT has been trained on. It's generally just what's on the internet, but when they do collect these data sets, they want to collect from a variety of sources. And so if your wiki is talking very similarly to some of these concepts, you'll find that ChatGPT is a very worthwhile companion. And so what that means is that you'll be able to use relatively simple prompts in order to create wiki content. So I create an example of create a Wikipedia style article on the history of the iPhone. I used a different one when I actually decided to play around with ChatGPT. And so you'll see that you can create a Wikipedia style article on why Britain left the EU. I'm not going to read this out for you. I didn't even read it to begin with, but essentially it'll keep going. The problem is it does hit an endpoint. Like I think the limit that they do is about 3,000 words for generation. And effectively, for it to keep going from there, you want to write some prompt like keep going or continue or something like that, and keep doing that until it's pretty much done. So that's one way to create content on something that's very common knowledge. But naturally, Wikipedia already exists, and many of you are going to have content on your wikis that is much more bespoke and therefore isn't something that you can freely find just like on a Google or Bing search. And so the rest of this presentation will be going in more specificity in what you can do to tackle that. So if you want to still use ChatGPT and just want it to be more specific, perhaps you already have some idea of what you want to write in your wiki, want to write, and you just have a summary of the rest of it. So this is what you can do. You can keep making these prompts longer. You can basically say what you've written already, and you can also just write a summary of the things that you want ChatGPT to write about, particularly because if you don't do that, it'll just generate whatever it wants. And naturally, when you want to write these wiki pages, there are specific things that you might want to talk about. So there are some pitfalls, and this is applicable to the last stage too, but it's worth talking about right now. So ChatGPT is basically, for lack of a better word, like a professional con artist at times, because it can basically confidently say anything, whether or not it's true or not. And usually for things that is closer to the data that it has been trained on, it will be pretty close to factual, and you won't have to do too much editing and checking. But it's important to do that anyway. For things that it doesn't know a lot about, like if I ask it about the ChatGPT API, or for example, this is something I did like a few weeks ago, it basically completely made up everything and gave me 1,000 words of complete falsehood. So you should check for that. The less that it reflects what data this model has already seen, the more likely it is to basically make up nonsense. And given that all of you are subject matter experts on the things you want to write about, it's important to check for that. And OpenAI and Microsoft are also overly cautious and making sure that no sensitive content is requested of or generated by ChatGPT. And at times they take this to the point of even asking things at like a PG-13 level or above is basically a no-go. They won't let you ask it. They won't give you it in your answer. And naturally, that means that even if you want to talk about some of these topics responsibly, perhaps to give some sort of content or educational purposes on it, then these models won't really help you do that. So essentially, you have to be careful that if you want to write on these types of subjects, or at least answer some questions on it that might matter, these models aren't going to help. It's not that generative models are incapable of generating this sort of content. You can find plenty of alternatives, which we will discuss shortly afterwards, that will do this stuff for you. But it's just that OpenAI and Microsoft are very concerned about brand safety, and as a consequence will err on the side of heavy caution as a consequence. So here's an example I took from the MyWikis website. Basically, I found an article about MediaWiki, and I took the first paragraph and basically did a very quick summary of what was there and saw what I would get. So I wrote 3 paragraphs and basically found 3 things I want to talk about. And so basically it generated an article that was pretty different from the one that I looked at to try and replicate, but it generally stayed pretty factual and did make a pretty strong case through MediaWiki. Now, I'll be honest and say that I don't have the domain expertise like to know like how accurate this is, but when I asked Jeffrey, he noted that it was pretty good. So I'll take that as a vote of confidence, and that is good. So let's go into even more granular level. Since, I mean, anyone can use ChatGPT. It's popular. Like, this talk is not just like a glorified prompt engineering tutorial. Like, naturally, you're going to want to get more and more detailed on things. ChatGPT still is on public domain content, and naturally, a lot of advantage comes from proprietary content or private domain, or just stuff that someone can't just Google or Bing within like 5 minutes and get an answer. And that type of content matters a lot to many of the private wikis that might be built. And so basically, a lot of you already have this sort of content, but what if I want ChatGPT or any generative model to learn from my existing wiki pages, to give it some sort of context as to stuff that it hasn't previously seen, and you don't want it to make up complete nonsense on the topic? So to do that, you're going to have to start going into much more specific solutions. Now, just using ChatGPT and just like playing around with it won't be enough. You can change up ChatGPT with OpenAI's completions API, which means, okay, I have some private wiki pages that are on content that it looks like ChatGPT does not know well. Fine, you can use this to effectively give this API these articles, and as input be like, maybe talk about the subject of the article, or maybe some sort of prompt that you'd want to use in order to create new wiki articles. Say, if you want to write something about MediaWiki, then it can be like, write me a Wikipedia article about MediaWiki, and then the answer would be the article that you have already written. And so you can basically continue training ChatGPT or any one of OpenAI's APIs to effectively learn how to generate wiki articles that are specifically related to the content that you've created. Bloomberg actually did something similar. They created their own language model from scratch. That's about probably a little bit larger than ChatGPT, if I had to guess, but nobody actually knows how big ChatGPT, but I'm pretty sure the estimates online are wrong, but sorry, I digress. So Bloomberg created their own model where they took all of their Bloomberg Business Week data, they took a bunch of their proprietary financial data, and they built an entire generative model on that so it would be good at generating financial specific data instead of just generic internet stuff. And obviously, we don't have the resources to spend $10 million to do so, but the idea that you can domain adapt and change these models to be specifically working toward your specific topic or area is something that has been shown and proven to work effectively. And you're not just limited to OpenAI's world. I've focused upon that because it's the easiest to work with and requires the least subject matter expertise and generally has a safe bar of quality, but there are alternatives. So the ones that are like API driven and don't really require a lot of background knowledge include things like Anthropic's Cloud, Cohere, AI21's Jurassic 2. All of these are available through a service called Amazon Bedrock, which allows you to take some of these generative models and effectively change them up and fine tune them, which is just another technical word for changing up a model a little bit, to essentially be able to generate wiki content specific to the topic you want to discuss, and that can incorporate some of the proprietary data that you have naturally collected over the years. So that is a service that exists for you AWS customers. You'll find that it just was released a week ago and should work just fine. I would steer away from anything generative that Amazon creates since their actual models, not their third-party partners, but their actual ones, don't tend to be the best. I've personally never really been all that impressed with Amazon's models, but that's just mostly a personal opinion, but just wanted to share that. So if you want to use open source stuff and don't want to be locked to an API, you're concerned about what happens if you give some of your proprietary wiki data to Amazon or Microsoft, or basically you want to keep things more private, you can use open source models. There is an AI company called Hugging Face that basically stores thousands, well, tens of thousands of models, and some of these models can generate content by themselves. They're not going to be as good as, say, the private APIs because, well, they're open source, they're free for anyone to use. But some examples I've listed here as good models that might be worth training. Dolly, GPT-J, GPT-Neo, OPT 2.7 billion, OPT 6.3 billion. These things might just basically be alphabet soup for you, but if you ever decide to do this, you can basically find these relatively easy. All of these are things that are very highly publicized. The LLM craze has basically meant that these should be fairly available. People won't stop talking about them. And so, yeah, finding them won't be too difficult. Just know if you want to basically do a DIY service with these, you are going to have to write your own code for it. You're going to have to learn how the library works. And you're going to have to accept that you might need one or more GPUs, because that's the type of thing that these models run best on. So DIY does require more work, but it allows you to protect your privacy and change things up according to your needs. But check for the licenses, because some of these models are not allowed to be used in commercial purposes. Facebook released a generative model called Llama, which is specifically blocked from using on a commercial basis. And a lot of these models, generative models that have come out recently, are all trying to improve upon that model. And so those two can't be used for commercial purposes. So watch out for the licenses. That can probably run into trouble. And given your own need to naturally protect your own content, this should be something that I imagine you sympathize with, given the need to protect content from, I don't know, OpenAI basically stealing all of your content and making it available for free. So that's all I had prepared. I'm happy to answer any questions or take any comments. But yeah, thank you.
Hey, 1 second. So there's one question that I actually have. I'll type it in for you.
Sure.
Backstage, see it. The audience is on a bit of a delay, so they'll catch up and then see if they have anything.
Okay.
I just typed mine in.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Is there any best practice recommendations for handling changes to wiki content as edits and content changes directly? Is there a workflow for training, fine-tuning, then push patches, additional tuning based on changes, and weekly, monthly full retraining? Can this be done currently with OpenAI's completion API? Okay, so I will basically go from the end to the beginning. So yeah, you can do smaller changes and larger ones over time in the specific way that you described. So essentially, the idea behind doing full retraining every 1 or 2 months is something that a lot of larger organizations do. The problem is that retraining a model like this takes millions and millions of dollars and is generally not really an effective approach. So one thing you can do is basically start from, say, OpenAI's API, and you can just keep training from it. So every time that a wiki article changes, okay, that's a new example of a new way that you can create a wiki article. If you do change it and it's slightly different, that just means that the model now understands that there are some slight deviances in how a model changes, and it can also become familiar with the way that you change up models. So that becomes an advantage. I don't think that you necessarily have to remove, say, the old data in your changelog, because that was mostly a perfectly fine wiki article. Now, if you do realize that, say, I don't like half of these wiki articles that are in my changelog, and as a consequence, I don't want the model to learn how to do it, then yeah, you can reset every so often and just take all of your wiki articles and like your changelog, remove the ones you don't want, and train entirely from scratch from like the OpenAI completion API. So you can do that. Their APIs are relatively cheap, so this type of, say, cautious strategy may not necessarily have to be followed in order to optimize costs. It is something that when the cost is much larger and you're dealing with, say, tens of thousands of dollars of spending, then it does matter. But yeah, it is a practice of just doing one-off updates to try and improve an API, and then every so often being like, all right, let's go look at my wiki changelog and see which articles I don't want the model to learn from, and then train from scratch. That is something you can do. And in terms of best practice recommendations for handling changes to wiki content, okay, I think I did cover that. Okay, so the next question. When creating an article, is it possible to restrict the set of sources used? E.g., the LLM should only use newspaper articles and journal papers. So the answer is yes, but most of the solutions I've described don't allow you to do that. One thing about OpenAI stuff and most of the other generative models is because they're big, they've learned to create their own content. And so if you copy paste the stuff that you get from, say, ChatGPT onto Google or Bing, you will find that there is like no article on the internet that copies exactly what it says. So it's pretty plagiarism proof, which is annoying if you put content publicly on the web that OpenAI or any other company scrapes and then just uses for their model. It's very difficult to figure out that it was plagiarized unless, well, your source is the only one on the entire internet that has this content and ChatGPT just happens to know it. And so in terms of restricting the set of sources used, one thing you can do is, especially in situations where you have very proprietary content, you can provide this content in ChatGPT or any other API's window to be able to show it. So like, for example, there's 2 or 3 wiki articles that you want it to use as sources and basically build into a new wiki article. You can pass those in as input to these LLMs to be able to generate new content. There are ways, like how Bard does things, to basically build a model that's specifically designed to retrieve documents from the internet. Although those things are harder to build, most of these large LLM companies don't support that. You have to go very deep into more so, I guess, bespoke models to do that. There is something called RAG, I think, that does that in a question answering basis. So you can answer questions based on retrieving documents specifically from that. Although I don't know how effective it might be for wiki generation. So it is an area that has been researched and has been shown to work really well. It just so happens that no one has really tried to support it for like large language models and generative beyond Bard, at least not in a way that would be open source. So you can do it, although it would take a fair bit of effort to make it work. And in general, none of the big AI companies have made that easy for you. But yeah. So next question. The founder of OpenAI predicts massive improvement in AI over the near future, with caveats including cost. How do you see AI impacting the future of Wikipedia itself? Chicken egg issue with the model being the human-generated content of Wikipedia. So this is a good question. It would probably take a very long time to go through like all the possible ways that this could occur. But so I think, at least by looking in the last 5 years of AI, one thing we've noticed is every given year has not really had a lot of big improvements. But if you look across the last 5 years or over a longer term, it's just like impressive just how big things have changed. Like even ChatGPT, its biggest impressive part is the fact that, well, most people did not know just how far generative AI had gone, even the people who have been innately familiar with the space, because, well, first GPT-3, which was the predecessor, came out in 2020. It was API locked, and so not many people had shown the examples that people were using. Even for open source models, people don't like spend hours and hours playing around and testing these things, except maybe for the creators. And so it basically seemed like a big jump from, say, I don't know, several years ago compared to ChatGPT today. And I think this just goes for technological innovation in general. We tend to overestimate what can be done in the short term, but vastly underestimate what can be done in the long term. So if near future means like in a year, yeah, I'll disagree with Sam Altman in that I don't think whatever OpenAI does in 2024 will be that much better than 2023. But in 2028, I'm pretty sure everything I've just talked about in the last 30 minutes is going to be completely obsolete, and everything we talk about will be entirely different. So that would be my response on that. So in terms of how AI impacts the future of Wikipedia itself, yeah, a lot of articles are probably, people are going to try to generate content and try to add that to Wikipedia. And that might be a concern. Most of these text-based models, sorry, not most, basically all of these text-based models today are trained on Wikipedia. Wikipedia has been one of the core reasons any sort of AI innovation text has happened. Like without it, there would be no GPT. There would be like no cool models. Like text models would pretty much be complete trash, and this entire AI revolution would have, most of it probably wouldn't even have happened. That's how transformative Wikipedia was for AI and text in general. Like every single person who's made money from this or like has learned from it, has built a career from this, should basically be thanking and like praying to Wikipedia because of just how valuable it was. But in terms of, yeah, people can use it to generate, and it is going to require that the people running Wikipedia be very cautious for factuality, be very cautious to make sure that the content that's being said is true. And I would argue, though, it's just pretty much no different than, say, handling like thousands or millions of volunteer contributors. ChatGPT is basically just a new contributor that is very well educated in the subject. And yeah, disinformation is a problem. ChatGPT won't be doing it, but you can find language models that are happy to make up fake stuff, and you can train them to do fake stuff, much like you can train them to write wiki articles that we've discussed. So you can train these models to do disinformation, and you can send those to Wikipedia. And so it's going to be up to the moderators to ensure that this stuff doesn't get through. And they're going to have to be more vigilant at a larger scale, because now the type of people who can mess up Wikipedia just found a way to be able to do this at a much lower cost. So Wikipedia's future is going to depend upon what the moderators and the people who run it ultimately are vigilant for. If they are not prepared to deal with the fact that people can mess up Wikipedia more cheaply and more quickly than before, and they're going to be in problems. But the good news is generative models can, in fact, be detected. The best way to stop a model is effectively to train a very similar model. So let's say I have a generative model called GPTX, and it's available online, and I'm a terrible person in basically creating fake Wikipedia articles on it that are malicious and are completely false and are very terrible. So the good news is I can create a model from that basically can detect whether or not content is generated by ChatGPT or not. So we can build models that can basically figure out if a very common generative AI built it or not. So there are models, there can be built models that are trained to figure out if ChatGPT wrote something. And so these Wikipedia creators can, in fact, use those to try and detect that. You can do this for any model, and this has been an active area of research since at least 2019. So yeah, I do think that the Wikipedia moderators are going to have to make use of these tools to detect where these articles came from, and to make sure they're not like ChatGPT or Cohere or GPT Neo X or Dolly or any of these models, and ensuring that, well, it's protected against. But I don't be happy to help them if they want to do that, but that's up to them to decide. So AI impact in the future, Wikipedia itself, it can do a lot of great things. It can do a lot of terrible things. It just depends upon what the mods do. And yeah, okay. I can answer the it directly from chat in the stage, since I do know I'm like 5 minutes over time. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I'll stop there.
No problem. Thank you very much, Gunjan. So, it's a very interesting topic, and I think it certainly seems like a technology, whichever the winner ends up being, that will be increasingly integrated into wikis in the future. So thanks for your time. If you don't hear it, there was a lot of clapping for you, and hopefully you can join us tonight at the Iron Cactus.